We need Greenland for national security. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
2 days ago, Donald Trump orchestrated the removal of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, a move that signals something fundamental has shifted in American foreign policy. And now Katie Miller and other Trump allies are posting maps of Greenland with American flags, captured simply soon. I'm Elle, I have a PhD in computer science and I work in finance where spotting geopolitical patterns is part of the job. And what I'm seeing right now is not a meme, it's a blueprint for extraction-based imperialism that could fracture NATO permanently. Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, so proud of my Danish there, just responded publicly. She wouldn't waste political capital on a joke, so let's talk about what happens when the United States decides that it wants Greenland and what's actually stopping them from just taking it. In the end, I will also get into my predictions for what I think happens next, but for now, let's just get into it. Now, this is not the first time Trump has floated taking Greenland. In 2019, he publicly expressed interest in purchasing Greenland from Denmark, a proposal that Frederiksen called absurd, rightfully so in my personal view. But here is what actually changed. Trump is now president again. His inner circle is openly posting annexation imagery, and the US just demonstrated that it's willing to execute regime change operations in the Western Hemisphere without consultation. According to the Reuters reporting to the Maduro situation, the Trump administration coordinated Maduro's removal with minimal allied input, a unilateral approach that breaks from decades of NATO consultation norms. When you work in finance, you learn to interpret patterns in decision-making, and this pattern basically says the second Trump administration views sovereignty as negotiable when American interests are at stake. Greenland is the world's largest island, home to approximately 57,000 people, and an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, but strategically it is invaluable. The island sits between the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, hosts a Thule air base, and contains massive untapped reserves of rare earth minerals essential for modern technology and defense systems. The question isn't whether Greenland is strategically important, everyone knows that it is. The question is whether we have entered an era where the United States believes that it can simply take strategic assets when diplomatic purchases fail. The world is getting louder, my friends. Algorithms fight for your attention. Politicians sell you easy answers. The media rewards outreach over truth. My book, Awake, teaches you how to think clearly through all of it. It's now available both as an ebook and an audiobook. Before you buy, read the first chapter completely free. Links are below. If it resonates, the full book is there with a 10% subscriber discount. Anyway, let's get back to the video. Let's talk about what Greenland actually represents financially and strategically, because this is where most analysis falls short. Let's talk about rare earth dominance for a second. According to the US Geological Survey in 2023, Greenland contains significant deposits of rare earth elements, materials essential for everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. Currently, China controls approximately 70% of global rare earth production, giving Beijing enormous leverage over Western defense industries. And when you work in finance, you kind of learn that supply chain vulnerabilities are pricing risks. The Pentagon has been actively pursuing rare earth diversification for years because China's export restrictions could cripple American weapon manufacturing. Greenland's mineral wealth is not just valuable, it is strategically irreplaceable. But here's the financial mechanism most people miss. Resource extraction in Greenland requires massive infrastructure investment. We're talking ports, processing facilities, transportation networks. Denmark, with a GDP of approximately $400 billion, cannot realistically finance this alone. But the US, well, maybe they can. The Arctic is warming faster than any region on Earth, unfortunately. According to NOAA's Arctic report card, this is opening new shipping lanes and resource access that were previously frozen. We have another video on that, check it out if curious. Russia has been aggressively militarizing its Arctic coastline, establishing bases and conducting exercises. China, despite having no Arctic coastline, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and invested heavily in icebreaker development. The Thule space base in Greenland is already America's northernmost installation, hosting ballistic missile early warning systems and space surveillance. But if the US controlled Greenland entirely, it could actually expand this to include anti-missile batteries, forward-deployed fire squadrons, and naval facilities capable of contesting Russian and Chinese Arctic expansion. Here's what these numbers actually mean financially. Control of Greenland would give the United States the ability to dominate Arctic resource extraction, interdict shipping routes, and establish military superiority in a region that will define 21st century's great power competition. The strategic value is measured not in billions, but in the ability to maintain global hedge competitors. So what is Denmark's vulnerability? Denmark is a NATO ally, but it's also a small nation with limited military capacity. The entire Danish military budget is approximately $7 billion annually, roughly what the US spends on a single carrier strike group. Denmark depends entirely on NATO, meaning primarily the United States, for its security guarantees. This creates a coercive dynamic that Trump's team absolutely understands. If the US were to pressure Denmark by threatening reduced security commitments, delaying F-35 deliveries, or even just publicly questioning NATO Article 5 obligations, Copenhagen would have almost no leverage. The official reports reveal a pattern here that smaller NATO members are structurally dependent on American military power in ways that make them vulnerable to American demands. So I was thinking, what would actually happen if the United States took Greenland from Denmark? Let's just game this out hypothetically. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is built on a foundational principle that member states respect each other's territorial integrity. Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause, only works if members believe their own sovereignty is secure. If the United States were to coerce or forcibly acquire Greenland from Denmark, it would shatter this foundational trust. According to Pew's Research Center polling, European public support for NATO has been historically strong, but there is growing concern about American reliability under Trump. An actual seizure of Greenland would trigger several possible responses. France and Germany have already been pushing for strategic autonomy and independent European defense capabilities. A US land grab from a NATO ally would accelerate this dramatically, potentially leading to a genuine European military force independent of NATO command structures. Then, if the US violates Denmark's sovereignty, why would Poland, the Baltic states, or Romania believe America would defend them against Russia? The entire deterrence architecture starts to collapse. Then there is also the economic decoupling. European states might respond with economic measures, restricting US-based access, limiting intelligence sharing, or even coordinating trade restrictions. This wouldn't cripple the US economy, but it would definitely end the pretense of a unified Western bloc. So what is this all about? Is US foreign policy now about raw extraction? Or is there something else, perhaps more sinister at play? I will actually be covering this question in a lot more detail in the next video, so definitely subscribe if you want to check it out. Let's look at the evidence about how much this is about raw extraction, though. The Venezuela operation removed Maduro, a leader sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Greenland contains rare earth minerals essential for defense manufacturing. Trump has previously suggested taking Syrian oil and has consistently framed international relations in transactional terms. And when you work in finance, you learn to distinguish between rhetoric and revealed preferences. The revealed preference here is clear. The second Trump administration appears to view international law and allied sovereignty as obstacles to resource acquisition, not necessarily as binding constraints. This is not technically unprecedented in American history. The annexation of Hawaii, the taking of the Philippines, the occupation of Iraq all followed similar patterns, but it represents a departure from the post-Cold War consensus that American power would be exercised through alliances and international institutions rather than open imperialism. So why did the Danish Prime Minister respond? Here is a question many people are asking. Why did she even bother responding at all? Why not just ignore what seems like Trump's latest provocation? Because she's reading the same signals that we are, right? When Katie Miller, a Trump insider and former advisor, posts annexation imagery, that is not just trolling, they are signaling something. When Trump's team coordinates complex operations like the Maduro removal, that demonstrates operational capability and political will. Frederiksen responded because silence would be interpreted as weakness. In international relations, when a powerful state makes territorial claims and you don't immediately reject them, you've implicitly accepted the negotiation frame. By responding publicly and firmly, she is essentially attempting to establish that Greenland's status is non-negotiable and rallying European support before any actual pressure begins. According to statements reported by Danish media, she emphasized that Greenland belongs to the Greenlandic people and that territorial questions are not up for discussion. This is diplomatic language for essentially, we see what you're doing and we're drawing a red line now. So what is actually stopping Trump? This is the biggest question, the most critical one. What is actually stopping Trump from just telling the military to just go and take Greenland? Legally, almost nothing, and that is the most terrifying part. If Trump ordered the seizure of Greenland, citing national security imperatives, the command structure would execute. Congress might object, but the War Powers Act gives the president enormous latitude for military action without congressional approval, similar to what just happened in Venezuela. Practically, however, the constraints are essentially NATO collapse. This would end the alliance, potentially permanently. European states would have to choose between accepting American imperialism or breaking with the US. Most would break. Then there's international isolation. The UN Security Council would condemn the action, though the US has veto power. Most of the international community would view this as illegal annexation, similar to Russia's taking of Crimea. Then there's domestic politics. There would be significant domestic opposition from foreign policy establishment figures, even many Republicans, but Trump has shown repeatedly that he's willing to ignore establishment consensus. And then there's Greenlandic self-determination. Greenland has autonomy within Denmark and could theoretically pursue independence. If Greenlanders themselves reject US control, occupation would require ongoing military presence against local resistance. The honest answer here is that very little stops the determined US president from seizing Greenland, except the calculation about whether the strategic gains outweigh the diplomatic and alliance cost. And given Trump's transactional worldview, he might calculate that Arctic dominance and rare earth access are worth NATO's collapse, which terrifies, I think, the majority of the earth. So here is what I'm watching for the next 6 to 12 months. Short term, the next 3 months. Trump, I think, will likely make explicit proposals to Denmark for Greenland purchase or long-term lease agreements. If Denmark refuses, expect American pressure through security cooperation channels, delayed equipment deliveries, reduced joint exercises, public questioning of NATO commitments. Watch for increased U.S. military activity in Greenland under existing base agreements, like the expansion of the existing bases, new temporary deployments that somehow become permanent. Let's look at the medium term, 6 to 12 months from now. If diplomatic pressure fails, Trump may pursue a Greenlandic independence referendum strategy, offering Greenland massive economic support and autonomy in exchange for alliance with the U.S. rather than Denmark. European states will accelerate strategic autonomy initiatives regardless of whether Greenland changes hands, because the threat itself undermines NATO cohesion. I think China will use this as propaganda ammunition, pointing to American hypocrisy and sovereignty issues. But what is the most likely outcome, you ask? I don't think that Trump would order an outright military seizure. The costs are too high, even for his administration. But I do think that we're entering a period of aggressive coercive diplomacy where the United States uses its military and economic leverage to effectively control the Greenland strategic infrastructure, even if the Danish flag technically remains there. This could take many different forms, like massive expansion of US-based presence under security partnership agreements, American companies securing exclusive mineral extraction rights through Greenlandic government deals that bypass Denmark, de facto U.S. control of Greenlandic airspace and territorial waters through joint operations, allegedly. The pattern is very clear, isn't it? American foreign policy under Trump is shifting from alliance management to transactional extraction. Greenland is the test case, and whether this succeeds or fails will determine whether we still live in a world where international law and alliance commitments constrain great power behavior, or whether we've just entered a new era of open imperial competition. Denmark's response matters a lot because it is the first pushback, but unless European states collectively draw hard lines and demonstrate that they are willing to break with the US over sovereignty violations, those lines will not hold in our favor. The question is not whether America wants it or not, it's whether anyone can actually stop it. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. A couple of days ago, the United States bombed Venezuela and captured Nicolas Maduro. The internet exploded, some celebrated a dictator's fall, others screamed about American imperialism, and the financial markets immediately started pricing in oil supply shocks. But here's what almost everyone missed. This is not about oil, it is about the dollar. And once you see the financial architecture at stake here, the timing makes perfect sense. I'm Elle, I have a PhD in computer science and I work in finance for spotting geopolitical patterns as part of the job. And what I'm seeing in the public data here reveals a structural problem that the US could not really afford to ignore any longer. In the end, I will get into my predictions for what I think happens next, but for now, let's get into it. To understand why Venezuela matters now, you really need to understand the structural problem Trump inherited. He's trying to deliver on three promises simultaneously, and they're mathematically incompatible. First, AI dominance. According to Goldman Sachs analysis, AI data centers are projected to drive an 160% increase in US power demand by 2030. The US isn't just competing economically here, this is an existential technological race against China. Winning requires massive amounts of cheap energy. Second, there is reindustrialization. Trump promised to bring manufacturing back from China, but EIA data shows US industrial electricity rates average $7.60 per kilowatt hour compared to China's $4.50. You can't really compete with Chinese factories when your energy costs are 70% higher. Third, protecting domestic shale. The US shale industry only becomes profitable around $60 to $70 per barrel. Too low and the entire sector faces bankruptcy. Too high and you lose industrial competitiveness. These three objectives create structural tension. You need cheap energy for AI and manufacturing, but not so cheap that you destroy your domestic energy sector. The traditional solution is to import cheap oil to subsidize domestic energy costs while protecting domestic production through strategic reserves and market interventions. But there is a problem with that strategy in 2025 and 2026. To understand that problem, you need to understand what Venezuela represents in the global financial system.
The world is getting louder, my friends. Algorithms fight for your attention. Politicians sell you easy answers. The media rewards outrage over truth. My book, Awake, teaches you how to think clearly through all of it. It's now available both as an ebook and an audiobook. Before you buy, read the first chapter completely free. Links are below. If it resonates, the full book is there with a 10% subscriber discount. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
Most people think that the petrodollar just means oil priced in dollars. We have another video on that. Check it out if you're curious. But this is just the surface level. When you work in finance, you learn to see the deeper architecture as well. The petrodollar system creates structural demand for dollars globally. It's not just about pricing. It is about which countries sell to which others, in what currency, and through which payment system. Control these flows, and you control what currency the world needs to buy to produce what it needs to produce. Here is where Venezuela becomes critical. In the 1990s and 2000s, Venezuela exported 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day to the US, all priced in dollars, all flowing through the US financial system. That is structural dollar demand. Every refinery buying Venezuelan crude needed dollars. Every transaction cleared through New York banks. Every payment reinforced the dollar's role in the global settlement currency. But today, according to Kepler shipping data, Venezuela exports approximately 844,000 barrels per day, much less, and 80 to 85% of that goes to China. In some recent months, that figure actually hit 90%. And here's the part that keeps US Treasury officials up at night. how does Venezuela get paid? Venezuela is largely cut off from SWIFT due to US sanctions, so these transactions happen through alternative mechanisms. Part of that oil goes directly as debt service. Venezuela owes China approximately $60 billion loan since 2005. The rest requires payment outside the traditional dollar banking system. Now, we actually have to read between the lines of official reports here. The US Treasury sanctions reports acknowledge that enforcement is challenging because of opaque financial requirements. That's essentially bureaucratic language for we can't track those flows anymore. The mechanisms likely involve some combination of yuan-denominated transactions, commodity swaps, and China's cross-border interbank payment system, KIPS, which processed over 80 trillion yuan in 2023. KIPS is essentially China's answer to SWIFT and is growing super fast. Venezuela also has rare earth elements and critical minerals essential for technology and defense. These resources matter because they reduce dependency on China and strategic supply chains, and also the reason why Trump is so interested in Greenland. We've got another video on that, check it out if you're curious. But if it were just about resources, the US has simpler options than military intervention. The real issue is what Venezuela represents, proof that the dollar system is bypassable. So this is not just about Venezuela, it is about precedent, right? Here's what these numbers actually mean financially. If Venezuela can not only survive but increase oil exports under maximum US sanctions while operating outside the dollar system, that proves the system has alternatives. It's a live demonstration to every other oil producer on Earth that there is a viable exit ramp, and they're watching. According to IMF data on currency reserves, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from 73% in 2001 to 58% in 2024. That is a 15 percentage point drop. We have another video on that too. And the rate of decline is accelerating too because most of that erosion has happened since 2014. Bloomberg also reported that non-dollar oil trade surged in 2023-2024 with significant increases in yuan-denominated transactions. Russia and Iran, also under US sanctions, have pioneered alternative payment rails using everything from cryptocurrency to barter arrangements to bilateral currency swaps. Brazil has been conducting bilateral trade with China, settling in yuan since 2023. The deal allows Brazilian exporters to receive payment in yuan and Chinese exporters to receive payment in reals, bypassing the dollar entirely. The official reports reveal a pattern. Sanctions are becoming less effective as financial technology enables alternative to SWIFT and dollar clearing systems. We are essentially looking at the rise of BRICS, and we have a separate video on that too. But here is what makes Venezuela specifically dangerous, its geography. Venezuela isn't in Central Asia or in the Middle East, it's in the Western Hemisphere, traditionally considered the US sphere of influence under Monroe Doctrine logic, which is ancient. If the US can't enforce dollar dominance in its own backyard, what is the signal to the rest of the world? When you interpret the public data through a financial lens, the message to other Latin American countries is unmistakable. If Venezuela can escape the dollar system while sitting in America's backyard, anyone can. And other countries are already testing the boundaries. Mexico has been exploring bilateral trade expansion with China, with trade volumes reaching over $100 billion annually. Colombia's current government has made friendly overtures to Beijing. Even traditionally pro-US Chile has participated in BRICS discussions and signed currency swap agreements with China. The US is not facing a minor policy annoyance. It is facing structural erosion of the financial architecture that underpins its global power. Think about what dollar hegemony actually means in practice. When most global trade requires dollars, other countries must hold dollars reserves. To get those reserves, they have to buy US Treasury bonds. That demand for treasuries allows the US to run massive deficits while keeping borrowing costs low. Essentially, the US can print money to pay for imports, and other countries just accept it because they need dollars for their own trade. But if countries can trade oil, minerals, and manufactured goods in yuan, rubles, and even their own currencies, that structural demand for dollars evaporates. Treasury yields rise. Deficits become more expensive to finance. The US loses the exorbitant privilege that has underwritten its geopolitical power since 1971. The world is shifting. Venezuela was not just operating outside the system, it was proving the system was optional. That is the crack in the foundation. So what is next? Based on historical patterns, when the US has intervened to protect dollar hegemony, here are 3 specific predictions. Prediction 1, rapid reconstruction of financial infrastructure. Within 60 to 90 days, I would expect announcements about Venezuela rejoining SWIFT and international banking systems. The US Agency for International Development will likely coordinate this under humanitarian reconstruction framing, but watch for provisions that route oil payments through New York clearing banks. This is not about charity. It is about reintegrating Venezuela into the dollar system before alternative payments rails become entrenched. Every month that passes with non-dollar systems in place makes them harder to reverse. Second prediction, strategic oil supply management. Don't expect Venezuelan production to immediately surge. The infrastructure has been deteriorating for years. According to OPEC data, Venezuela's production capacity has fallen from 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to around 800,000 barrels today. Rebuilding that takes years and billions in investment. But what matters is not immediate production, it's actually just optionality. Control over when and how Venezuelan oil enters global markets gives the US a pressure valve for managing domestic energy costs while protecting shale producers. This is about market power, not volume. The US can now credibly threaten to flood markets if OPEC cuts production too aggressively. It can promise additional supply to allies facing energy security concerns, and it can keep prices in that sweet spot where shale remains profitable, but industrial electricity stays competitive. Third prediction, accelerated pressure on BRICS alternatives. This intervention sends a signal to every country exploring non-dollar trade. The US will use force to protect dollar dominance in its hemisphere. Watch for increased economic pressure on Brazil, diplomatic frictions with Mexico over its China trade, and potential sanction threats against countries that continue building yuan-based trade infrastructure in Latin America. The mechanism will likely be subtle, maybe not direct military threats, but conditional trade agreements, coordinated lending restrictions through the IMF and World Bank, and strategic tariff adjustments that punish countries diversifying away from the dollar. Here is what I'm watching in the data over the next 6 to 12 months. BIS statistics on cross-border payment systems will show whether there is any reversal in the trend towards non-dollar settlement. If the Venezuela intervention successfully discourages other countries from building alternative systems, we will see that growth flatten or even reverse. Venezuelan oil export routing data from Kepler will reveal whether flows shift back towards U.S. refineries. Watch especially for long-term supply contracts announced with specific payment terms. That's where you'll see the financial reintegration happening. There's also currency swap agreements between China and Latin American countries will probably indicate whether new deals slow or accelerate. If China responds by doubling down on bilateral currency agreements, that signals this is becoming a direct financial confrontation between dollar and yuan systems. The suffering of the Venezuelan people under Maduro's dictatorship is real, and many will genuinely celebrate its removal. But when you work in finance and study geopolitical power systems, you kind of learn to separate humanitarian rhetoric from structural incentives. This intervention is about reasserting control over the financial architecture that makes U.S. global power possible. The timing, right as Trump faces his country's dilemma, and as the dollar's reserve status shows accelerating erosion, is not coincidental. The U.S. did not bomb Venezuela to liberate its people. The U.S. bombed Venezuela because the dollar system could not afford for the president to stand. And once you see that, everything else starts making sense. Thank you so much for watching. Check out this other video that I've linked here on the BRICS currencies taking rise, and I'll see you all next month.
It's like every time you turn on the TV, there is a new major development. Yeah, maybe you thought that you would have a nice, relaxing afternoon on the beach. But nope, they took a tanker. Oh, yikes, make that two. Ooh, it had a Russian flag. Indeed, 2026 is the year that keeps on giving with world conflict. So let's spend yet another day trying to dissect what happened. First, with the descriptive facts about the seizures. Then how this fits into the great game featuring the United States, China, and Russia. And finally, what is happening with the oil diplomacy in Venezuela, which is how these seizures got started in the first place. Okay, regarding the two seizures, one of these was fairly simple. This is U.S. Southern Command video of the capture of the MT Sophia. It was holding about 2 million barrels of crude and tried to run the U.S. blockade around Venezuela. Do not know why you would try to do that at this point, but they did. The U.S. Coast Guard seized the vessel, and there is not much more to report on here. The other situation is much more interesting. At almost the same time, the United States also seized the MV Bella 1. You might recall that this was the tanker that had been the subject of a weeks-long slow-speed chase that would make O.J. Simpson blush. It remains a bit of a mystery why the United States chose not to board the Bella while it was still near the blockade assets. There may be insufficient Coast Guard forces in the region to handle the abundance of seizure targets if multiple move at the same time. Thus, it sped away at about 9 knots, which is considerably slower than what U.S. naval vessels can travel at. As such, they just stayed behind, watching from afar. What made the situation bizarre is that the tanker did not have any oil aboard, and its previous port call was in Iran. This led to speculation that it may have been trying to covertly deliver weapons to Venezuela, and so it ran away from the blockade to try to hide that. Again though, that is just speculation at the moment, even if it is still something to keep an eye on. Anyway, to celebrate the new year, the ship renamed itself the Marinera, and tried to change its flag mid-voyage by painting the Russian tricolor on the side of the ship. That, of course, is not something that you can do according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which only gave the United States more justification to board it. Then came reports that Russia sent a submarine to first rendezvous with the Bella before escorting it somewhere, presumably Russia. Of course, the United States intercepts tankers by deploying troops via helicopter. Consequently, I am not exactly sure what Russia's plan was here. Launch supercavitating torpedoes at the vessels from which helicopters could depart from? Congrats. That sends you straight to World War III. So the helicopters just landed as they did when they captured the skipper, as seen here. The tanker formerly known as the Bella did not make it past Iceland. As always, the key to winning confrontations between nuclear powers is to force the other side to shoot first. They cannot without risking a larger exchange, and so you get to win the battle by default. If Russian soldiers were physically aboard the ship, that would be one thing. U.S. troops would have to shoot through them to capture the tanker, and so the White House would not even order them to board the ship. Do not be surprised if that is the next step for tankers departing from Russian ports, as Russian mill bloggers and hawkish lawmakers are up in arms over this. Submarines, though, are a no-go. And so the United States has won the round without much effort. Now, do not immediately expect the United States to extend the campaign to the rest of the Shadow Fleet operating out of Russia. Well, at least not directly. Indirectly, the United States has been feeding intelligence to Ukraine to do that. But it does show that the United States will not allow Moscow to extend its network unimpeded. Anyway, I think this speaks to a larger but silly narrative that has been making the rounds since the 3-hour fracas in Caracas. This is the one that says that some sort of grand conspiracy has been brokered among Russia, China, and the United States, where Russia has been granted its former near abroad as its zone of influence, China has been granted Taiwan, and the United States has been granted the Western Hemisphere. What we have seen over the last week is allegedly the first step of implementing the new policy. Okay, this is wrong on so many levels. For one thing, any sort of grand conspiracy of areas of influence as a general concept would not be anything new. The world has always worked that way. It was just a question of whose lines went further. I suppose it is okay if people have forgotten about the Concert of Europe, But the Cold War was exactly this principle, and a whole lot of people are still around to remember it. For another, good luck to Russia trying to take Ukraine even if the United States gave the country away. Moscow has been trying to do that for 4 years now, and still only has 20% of Ukraine to show for it. Even if the United States stopped providing intelligence to Ukraine, and stopped selling arms to Ukraine via the NATO Pearl Initiative, Russia still would not be able to rapidly conquer Kyiv. And the rest of the near abroad? Unless something changes inside of Russia to allow the Kremlin to engage in mass mobilization, Russian troops stand little chance of succeeding anywhere around the Baltics, Poland, or Finland. The military is just far too depleted after what has happened in Ukraine. A similar sentiment applies to China. As it stands now, China is probably incapable of taking Taiwan in a cost-effective manner. The same claim may be questionable in, say, 5 or 10 years. That timeline explains a lot of how we got into this mess, with the Pentagon long trying to complete an Indo-Pacific pivot precisely to stop that. But there is still no deal to be struck there. In any case, to put it all together, there is nothing for Russia and China to trade with the United States. The United States can do what it wants in the Western Hemisphere because it has the power to do so, and neither Beijing nor Moscow has the power to stop it. You cannot extract concessions without leverage, and they have none. That is why they look on helplessly from their capitals. And that takes us to the final question for today. If the United States can do what it wants in the Western Hemisphere without overseas influence, what exactly does it want to do in Venezuela? Well, part of that is to terminate Russian and Chinese influence in the country. But with that checked off the list right now, there are some economic considerations at play. A Trump Truth Social post from last night provided what appeared to be some indication of the next steps. Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the United States of America. This oil will be sold at its market price, and that money will be controlled by me to ensure that it is used to benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Q concerns that Trump is coercing Venezuela to extract all of its oil, effectively holding its now acting president Delcy Rodriguez as a de facto hostage. Cooperate with their oil extraction, or we will do to you what we did to Maduro. In light of both Trump's comments and that concern, I think it is worth keeping an eye on exactly what will happen here. At the same time, I also think it is worth treating Trump as an unreliable narrator. Not necessarily because he has malicious intent, but rather because he tailors basically everything he says to the small percentage of Americans who like big numbers and a tough-talking president. In addition, Trump has never been great at articulating the nuances of geopolitical strategy, as we saw at the press conference following the capture of Maduro. So let him say the splashy stuff, but perhaps do not pay much attention to the particulars of his words. I know that sounds weird given that he has the bully pulpit, and so news organizations are going to print what he has to say. However, for the most part, I am instead paying attention to Marco Rubio if I want to understand the nuance of Venezuelan policy. This is for a few reasons. 1, he has always been better at communicating nuance. 2, it is his job as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to craft policy. Better to hear it from the source than it is to play a game of telephone with Trump. And 3, Venezuela has always been his pet project, so he is almost certainly running point on all of the major moves here. Of course, Trump is still president and can still override him, so I am not completely ignoring Trump. The hierarchy here is Rubio then Trump, not vice versa. And the nuance of the policy from Rubio is that the United States will effectively be playing the role of an escort. Venezuela hands over the crude to the United States. The United States then sells the crude on the international market, notably at regular market rates, not at the discount that Venezuela previously gave on the gray market. The United States then holds that money and only disperses it if Venezuela meets certain conditions. This is a fairly normal way of actually conducting a regime transition, which again, looking to Rubio, is still important. Rodriguez stays in her position because neither party wants Venezuela to descend into chaos. But if the oil is free-flowing and without any conditions, it is very easy for Venezuela to return to a majority system. Now, the United States wields great leverage here. The embargo effectively leaves Venezuela with few other options, so it can enforce quite a few terms on Venezuela, with Rodriguez's only business play to shut down the oil wells entirely. That leads to questions of exactly how much the United States will extract as the escrow agent. The answer is nearly all of it, and the terms are give maybe $1 to the people of Venezuela, but then keep whatever remains for yourself. Then you can imagine the international condemnation that will follow, never mind what Congress will be interested in. But at least for the time being, this is exactly how a sanctions regime would normally operate, minus the rather abnormal social media buzz, and minus to a lesser degree the congressional concerns if Trump truly ends up in direct control over the money, rather than through a domestic legal process. Meanwhile, if you want to learn more about the crisis in Venezuela, check out the full playlist that I have on the subject. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.
The fact that they have announced that they're sending a submarine out there either demonstrates that they felt they had to do something, or the Russian flag means zero on the side of that vessel, or it demonstrates that the Russians really are powerless to do anything about this.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1415 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking to General Ben Hodges, an old friend of the show. General Ben, an infantry officer at heart, a military planner and former commanding general of the US Army Europe, and he co-authored Future War and Defence of Europe, and frequently provides analysis on European security matters in the international media. And he's an old friend of the show. General Ben, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you very much.
Well, talking of the year starting, it's the 7th of the month, and just as we're recording this, we're getting reports that the US Coast Guard, supported by the US military, and it's quite clear it looks like Special Operations Forces are boarding what was the Bella 1, that is now the Marinera, and changed its flag from Guyana to Russia, international waters in the Atlantic. What do you think is going on, and why do you think this tanker is of such interest?
I don't know that there's any special cargo on this tanker other than Iranian oil, but it was sanctioned over a year ago. And this may be an occasion where the Trump administration was actually finally enforcing sanctions. And so I don't know that there's more to it than that. The fact that they painted a big Russian flag on the side of the vessel while it was underway is an interesting twist to this. I can't predict how the Russians will react, or they will react. And if this is being done on a legal basis, I would certainly be supportive of it.
Well, it's interesting that the beginning of the course, the Russians sent a submarine to escort it. You don't send a submarine to escort a surface ship if there's a danger for boarding or anything else. So it seems like there's a bit of information going on.
I think that's probably very good. If you remember when the Estonians seized one of the Shatterford vessels that were not a Russian vessel, and the Russians denied it was theirs, but yet the Russian Air Force came out there and stopped the Estonians from boarding it. So I'm only guessing here, but the fact that they have announced that they're sending a submarine out there either demonstrates that they felt they had to do something, or the Russian flag means zero on the side of that vessel, or it demonstrates that the Russians really are powerless to do anything about this.
But again, that's an interesting point, and we'll explore that later. The powerlessness of Putin and the Russians, and maybe President Trump is starting to show that to them. Maybe Vladimir Putin has got Donald Trump's displeasure somehow or other, because it seems as 2025 finished, there was a very close and closer relationship building with Vladimir Putin. But then
the fact that Trump wants to fundamentally change the U.S. political system so there are no longer checks and balances on his presidency. My principal enemies are inside the House. They almost tried to kill me. It was this close. Reality has punched him in the face. I think that what Epstein represents to Americans are these assholes can get away with anything.
Coming up next on This is Gavin Newsom, I just sat down with Ian Brenner, the founder and president of the Eurasia Group, started G0 Media. It's a fancy way of saying a world-leading expert on geopolitical risk, on politics, on business and its intersection, and of course this week highlighted by the visit of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. There's so much to discuss around the world we are living in, the trend lines that define this moment, and what to expect in the future.
This is Gavin Newsom.
And this is Ian Brenner. Ian Brenner, good to be with you.
Good to be with you, Gavin.
Where were you? We're in San Francisco.
Yeah.
You made it all the way out west.
Yeah.
Are you a product of the East Coast? What are you doing out here?
Yeah. I grew up in Chelsea, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. I live in New York now.
All right. Well,
And I like it. I do like it.
do you like it?
I can't move now.
Okay. Well, I'm not trying to. That's a good point, and we'll get to a little bit of the East
I lived
Coast.
out here for a few years.
Where were you?
Stanford.
Were you? Oh, of course you
Yeah,
were.
sorry.
Of course you were.
Hey, they let me in. Kids
That's
from the
good.
projects let me in Stanford. I could drop it right away.
Well, you're at Columbia University as well. You're all over. But look, let's contextualize, because I think for me, I'd like to sort of level set about, sort of in the Tom Friedman zone of what world are we living in? I mean, what world are we living in, sort of globally? What are the trend lines that define the world we're living in? What's your sense of the moment we're in globally?
Well, the biggest thing that is so unusual in my histories is that the United States, we are now driving the greatest level of geopolitical uncertainty, right? It's not China, it's not Europe. Russia's certainly a problem, but comparatively small. No, it's the question of what does the United States want? It's whiplash from one administration to the next. And it is absolutely an unwillingness to be the reliable partner on the set of rules that the Americans had instituted, and mostly, though not always, by collective security, free market trading, the rule of law, foreign aid, all of these things. Huge question. And countries all over the world, especially our allies, saying we don't believe that the United States is reliable going forward.
So we should be reliable. So you've written a lot about this notion of unpredictability, reliability, but never both. And that's the world that we're living in. This notion of being unreliable and unpredictable. That's anomalous. By Trump 1.0 terms?
Completely. Yeah. I mean, they've been through Trump 1.0. I think a lot of people 2.0 would be the same. Really wrong. Right? So much more willingness to break furniture on tariffs, for example. On trying to fix deals, for example. Just a very, very assertive, this is my opportunity. My principal enemies are inside the House. Right. They almost tried to kill me. It was this close. And so I have to be a revolutionary president.
And you've used that word revolution And some people have balked at that, saying that may be overstated, though you've made the point, not dissimilar to Gorbachev himself, some of the revolution we saw, this economic revolution in China, that you can certainly make the case that Trump's policies vis-a-vis the rest of the globe is revolutionary.
I think that, again, in our lifetimes, and this is why the geopolitical uncertainty from the U.S. is so great, there have really been 3 attempted revolutions that have had global impact. The first, Deng Xiaoping, an economic revolution, not a political revolution, in China, successful, and brings China ultimately into the WTO and into the global economy. The second, under Gorbachev, when I cut my teeth as a graduate student, my first trip outside the U.S. was to the Soviet Union in '86 when he had first come in.
Huh.
This was a political and an economic revolution. Completely failed. And the Soviet Union collapsed as a consequence. And the third, a political, though I would argue not an economic revolution, here in the United States by Trump. And we don't know if it's going to be successful or not. And by the way, Steve Bannon would completely agree with that. He wants it to be successful. You absolutely don't. A lot of people feel very differently. But the fact that Trump wants to fundamentally change the U.S. political system so there are no longer checks and balances on his presidency, either from inside the administration or from the party or from the administrative state or from the judiciary. I mean, or from the media. I mean, as we saw, you and I are taping this on a day that Trump, went directly after ABC and said they should have their license taken away, didn't like the question, tells the head of the FCC, you should be looking into that right now. That is not historically something that is compatible with the United States, but under a political revolution, it might be.
And you say not an economic revolution, a political revolution, but you just referenced the economic revolution in China. Some have equated the economic policy shifts in the United States to aspects of Chinese state capitalism. This notion that we have seen, or not just notion, but we've seen some of the transactions that have come with the 10% ownership into Intel, obviously these golden shares with U.S. Steel, NVIDIA and AMD, even MP Materials here in the state of California, disproportionate number of California-based companies. Yeah. Aspects, sort of component parts of state capitalism, though have they not entered into political context?
Industrial policy, absolutely. You just picked all the big ones, by the way. So, I mean, it's not like you can say that across the U.S. economy at all. The biggest American companies are spending lots of money on the Trump administration to ensure that they can continue to essentially capture the regulatory environment, not the other way. So my view is that there are similarities between China and the United States in the way the economy runs. In China, the state captures the corporations. In the United States, the corporations capture the state, right? Where in Europe, right, the state actually stands pretty much outside, and its superpower is a regulatory superpower, which sounds great for the social contract until you realize that there's no growth next year. Yeah.
So from a perspective, back to sort of the alliance, there's some alliances and now this notion of predictability or unpredictability, reliability. Would you describe, an alliance-first framework that sort of defines the post-World War II order the last 75, 80 years to now an American-first framework, or is it an economic-first framework? Or is it just Trump an impulse in the context of what his revolutionary construct or ideological frame represents?
Well, so one of the reasons why I don't think it's an economic revolution is because even though Trump might be interested in some of that stuff, reality has punched him in the face. So, for example, he tried to start a trade war with China and force them to bend the knee. He tried to put an effective economic boycott on the Chinese. It didn't work. Yeah. Xi Jinping wasn't getting on the phone and jumping and saying, "Please, sir, can you take this off?"
Did that surprise you, the extent to which China leveraged, particularly on rare earth minerals, their strategic strengths in relationship to that? Do you think that, was that a surprise, not only from your perspective, but do you think that surprised the Trump administration?
Oh, it clearly surprised the Trump administration. The part that surprised me was not the capabilities that the Chinese had developed in critical minerals and rare earths. We've been building these up for decades. It's very obvious that this is like a really strategic move to have that leverage. But what surprised me, and I think surprised a lot of people in the field, was the view that their ability to suddenly actually regulate licensing and have a scalpel that would allow you to really hit American companies and not necessarily hit other companies. And to be fair, like when they announced these licensing agreements, suddenly everyone is trying to make applications in China, and it's thousands of applications. They don't have staff to actually deal with them. So it did cause damage. For example, China's relations with the EU right now are markedly worse than they were a few months ago, in part because they weren't as capable to really use this as a lever just against the United States and just against American companies. But their willingness to do that, together with their getting up to speed really, really fast, I think was surprised everyone to understand. And the fact is that the Trump administration is not ready to have this fight with the Chinese. Now, what does that mean? In part, that means that the Americans need friends, need allies. It turns out inflation is higher than Trump thought it was going to be. And what does that mean? It turns out that like a lot of those tariffs on food and on coffee and bananas, other things, turns out, well, you got to take those off. Turns out that Trump probably doesn't have the ability to use IEPA individually as the president, as everything is a national emergency, no matter what country, no matter how poor, how rich, how small, how big. And that the Supreme Court, at least the initial arguments look like that's going to hit him back pretty hard. All of that implies that he may have an idea, grand idea, that I'm the biggest actor out there, and therefore the law of the jungle, I'm the predator. And so as the apex predator, everyone has to bow to me. But, even the apex predator, picks off like a wounded wildebeest, but doesn't go after the entire herd simultaneously. Turns out it's not really working for him. I think that in the past few weeks, we've actually past the tipping point where Trump's global unilateralism is really getting constrained.
Sort of peak Trump in that. And IEPA is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, of which Trump has asserted, it's being litigated in the Supreme Court, that he has the unilateral authority without congressional approval to move forward with these tariffs.
Yes.
But even, of course, if the Supreme Court adjudicates against that authority under the merger, he still substantially can find other avenues to advance the tariff.
But it would take time.
Yeah.
And expectations for where the global blended tariff average from the United States would be would probably be 3 to 6 points lower than they presently are.
Which is roughly, what is it, 17? It depends on the average.
It depends on whether you're saying what he has or what they're actually implementing, but something between 13 and 17,
And it's the highest since the 1930s.
Without any question. And that's the single biggest thing he's done on the global stage so far.
So, and it seems to me that's the entire policy. I mean, every single thing is leveraged. Every conversation is leveraged in the context of that cudgel, isn't it? The tariff cudgel. With him.
I mean, the Russia-Ukraine thing, clearly it's whether or not, you remember when the Ukrainians, when Zelensky came to the Oval, that horrible shambolic meeting, and he cut off intelligence and defense support for a week or two. That wasn't trade, but my God, that was important, sent a big message to the Europeans. There have similar in terms of the Abraham Accords and the F-35. So American military capabilities also have, I would say that's another significant piece of leverage.
So let's reinforce that in the context of the meeting that the president just had in the Oval Office with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Talking about transactions around F-35s, talking about potentially, though apparently they didn't talk about the Abraham Accords, but they did a bit to pull potentially to get Saudi Arabia as part of that. So give me your over/under in terms of that relationship, which is to me fascinating, also deeply predictable, because there's sort of a crony component of that as well. There's a little bit of self-dealing that seems to attach itself, respectfully from my perspective, to all things Saudi Arabia and the Trump family. But how did you perceive that meeting, the importance of it, a little bit of the controversy around it, particularly in relationship to the murder of the Washington Post reporter? What was your sense of that?
Well, There's so much to unpack here. Saudi Arabia today, over 30 million population in the region, is transforming itself in ways that if you haven't traveled to the kingdom recently, is shocking.
In a positive way,
In an
mostly.
incredibly positive way. That this Mohammed bin Salman, if there were elections in Saudi Arabia, would almost certainly win 80, 85, 90%
Wow.
of the votes. He is, women were 11% of the workforce 10 years ago. They're now 36% in 10 years.
Yeah.
It's like a reverse Iranian revolution, right? They're diversifying the economy. So it's not just oil and petrochem. It's actually meant to, and it's technology and it's tourism and it's sports and it's health and it's all of these things.
Comedy.
They even did that comedy festival recently. Absolutely. And so you go and you see that suddenly like men and women are actually able to talk to each other. And I remember the first time I went to Saudi Arabia, local men referred to women as MBOs, moving black objects, because they were completely covered by the niqab, and you couldn't see them aside from this little slit, with their eyes. And they certainly weren't playing any role in terms of social public culture. That has completely changed. There are no religious police on the streets anymore. All of that is extraordinary. So any country in the world, not just the United States, that is thinking about what are the future-oriented governments that you should be engaging with, Saudi would be on your list. Having said that, the Khashoggi assassination, which the CIA said under Trump said Mohammed bin Salman was directly aware of, right? And then so suddenly today, and no one is, Khashoggi is no longer a thing in the sense that it was many years ago. You got Davos in the desert, all of the bankers, the industry leaders from the US and other countries, they're all going. It's not like the Saudis are suddenly a pariah state, not at all. And I think Biden made mistakes on that, frankly, not reading the room. But for Trump to then take a question and pretend that not only did this incident not happen, to whitewash it and say, well, Mohammed bin Salman, he knew nothing about that. To say that, well, this guy, Khashoggi, was a bad guy. Like, what? You don't need to do any of that. And yet it's almost like he takes pleasure in the opportunity in undermining the values that the United States has at least tried to stand for much of its recent history.
Net positive. So what
Yeah,
you're
net positive.
Yeah, I mean, and he was treated like a head of state, even though he's technically not the head of state. But
Yeah, there's still a king. Yeah.
But as it relates to, so it gives us opportunity just maybe then to get into the Middle East and the Middle East politics a little bit. The Abraham Accords are a big success for the Trump administration 1.0.
Arguably his largest success.
Largest success.
Yeah.
And what I love about you call balls and strikes. You're nonpartisan, and you're able to assess things without a deeply political lens, which I think is critical and important. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, particularly folks in my party. But as it relates to where we are today and the ability to build on that success and the relationship to this quote-unquote Middle East peace deal, the most significant, Trump sort of triumph, and the challenges that persist in Gaza, Hamas, who appears not to have any interest in eliminating or at least setting down their arms, the challenges with the next phase of that peace deal, the importance of Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel, but first Israel recognizing a Palestinian state. How do you feel the state of the Middle East is today?
Well, so first, balls and strikes, let's give Trump credit where credit is due. Nobody thought that Hamas was going to actually release all of the living Israeli hostages. And they did, with Trump pressure. And it was at the United Nations General Assembly, and I remember when he stood up, and the speech was way too long, almost an hour, and there were only two applause lines, one when he finally finished. And the other, when he said, you want to end the war, Hamas has to let the hostages go. And almost everyone in the room thought that. But no one thought it was going to get done. He got it done. He got it done by also orchestrating a summit on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and you were there in New York with me as well, with all of the leaders from the region, not the Israelis, saying here's the 20 or 21 point plan, depending on who you talk to, that they then mostly got an agreement on, and recently they just got it passed by the Security Council.
Which is remarkable.
Which is remarkable. The Russians and the Chinese abstained, and everyone else sort
Israel was a
of...
little bit, they were a little bit on the side.
They were chippy. They were chippy.
That's the right word, chippy.
Yeah.
No, but that was...
But to go from a position where the United States had been almost isolated completely on the global stage in its support to Israel, to having the U.S. lead diplomacy with the Security Council voting in favor and only 2 abstentions from American adversaries, that's an extraordinary win.
Yep.
Give him credit. When Trump went to the Knesset, gave that speech, he was a hell of a lot more popular there than Prime Minister Netanyahu is, right?
Yep.
Clearly. So that's the positive.
Yeah.
Negative is getting this deal from ceasefire to a Palestinian state is really, really not looking very likely right now. And that's why the Saudis were not prepared to show any leg on the Abraham Accords. And when I was in Riyadh, same thing. They're like, we're very happy. We'd like to do it. We'd like to engage. We'd like the technology, all that stuff. Right. But not until we see a clear pathway to a Palestinian state. And right now, with this leadership in Israel, it is not happening. So you saw Trump just brought the Kazakhs into the Abraham Accords. You see that?
I saw that
a week ago.
They're not even, it was an unrelated party.
Well,
but it was just to show momentum.
They already had relations with Israel for like decades.
Yeah.
It's like when Trump announced that he ended the Azeri-Armenia war, which is great because they weren't actually fighting.
Nobel Prize and the 10 peace deals.
I know. But the point is, the Abraham Accords are not going to include the Saudis. That is the reality.
Yeah. What's your over-under? And I've been reading some of the things you put out. How concerned are you about Hezbollah? How concerned are you about what's happening in Beirut? Or not happening? Where do you see things going in the short term?
Well, the Lebanese government, after the ceasefire, said that they were going to work to ensure that the heavy weaponry that Hezbollah had in the south of the country near the Israeli border, that they were going to destroy that critical infrastructure and make sure that those weapons weren't there. They've done none of that. But a couple of cases where U.S. has intelligence, provides the Lebanese government, they respond to that, but this has not been proactive. Nobody thinks they're going to get this done. And that means that Israel is going to start mowing the grass again. And that means more strikes by the Israelis. I expect it. Now, whether or not that is limited strikes, drones, missiles, aircraft just across the border, or whether that includes special forces insertion in Beirut, there's a big difference between those two things. Either could happen. But I'd be stunned if we have this staying quiesced over the coming months.
Tony Blair heading this effort in Gaza. What's your overall success in that respect? I mean, the idea that Hamas is not going to come down their arms of an international security force coming in, armed security force, seems less likely under those circumstances.
Less likely, but also everyone that's been traveling to this coordination center that they've set up just on the Israeli side of the Gaza border, and it has like one floor with the Israelis, one floor with the Americans, then one floor with the multinationals. And apparently, first of all, much bigger, much more capable than people think. The U.S. much more directly involved now in terms of ensuring that humanitarian aid is getting in. The Israelis are in some of the meetings. They're not in all of the meetings. So there is an effort to really have people that are capable of moving the ball and also, as the administration has called it, babysitting. So senior officials that are constraining him so that he can't destroy the progress in the process. Now, also, Tony Blair, a controversial figure, but is well regarded, well respected in the Gulf. He brings far more political influence and leadership to a Gaza role than anyone else plausible. Interestingly, the Jordanians have been really opposed to it. And I haven't been able to figure out why.
No history when he was prime minister and with the king. I mean,
with Iraq a little bit, sure, but still surprising to me. I mean, it might be that Abu Mazen is opposed to it and has used the Jordanians to say, hey, sort of, he's going to be tough on us. I'm not sure, but I think that everyone would be fortunate to have Blair in this role, frankly.
Your perspective was the right thing to do to go in and go after those nuclear facilities, the United States, and those strikes.
Well, they worked, right?
worked.
I mean, you're talking about intelligence estimates are you probably delayed the Iranian program by some 12 to 18 months, and the Iranians were incapable of any response, marshaling any response to Israel or the United States. Most of it was done by the Israelis. The Americans saw that was successful and nothing happening. Trump wanted to get in. But then the war was over in short order and no American boots on the ground. So, look, on balance, with an Iranian government, remember, Trump had Bibi in the Oval Office, and while he was there, announced, I'm going to start engaging with the Iranians. I want to see if we can get to a diplomatic deal. And there was some effort, and the Iranians weren't really willing to go there. So ultimately, that meant, I mean, this is not like the Gaza situation, certainly not like Qatar, where the Israelis made strikes the Americans weren't happy about it. In the case of Iran, the United States was pretty much on board with, okay, we'll let you guys have at it.
Let's go back to China. It's interesting to me, just with a weaker economy, we talked a little bit, I mean, this notion that they were able to flex with a little more precision and push Trump back, though we still have outrageously high tariffs, and that's going to impact, it's already impacting prices, as you suggest, but particularly this Christmas, where 80% of our toys come from China, so you feel there's better action. I mean, people are starting to absorb these tariffs as well. Those first units. So there's back to certain realities are hitting up in the face in terms of Biden years vis-a-vis China, how Trump is posturing the relationship issue. Right? What do you see things in this situation in context today around the media, sort of decompressing the stress? Where in this goes 2 to 5
The Chinese are very confident they benefit the United States as a country that is less reliable is creating big opportunities for China. The U.S. shuts down USAID. Who's going to be the principal on the left and the south? It's going to be the Chinese. The U.S. doesn't show up at the top summit that we went to in Brazil. Who's driving technology at scale for post-carbon energy? The Chinese. The Americans are scaring off brown people that might want visas to get higher education in the United States. Who's now trying to make visas easier for people to come in?
Yep.
The Chinese. So long term, Xi Jinping is going to be there in all likelihood a lot longer than Trump is.
Right.
He believes this is an opportunity. I would argue he is also overplaying his hand.
Xi.
Xi is. Yeah.
In which respect, or what respect?
That when he decided to put that loaded gun on the table that said, here is what I can do in weaponizing these critical minerals that are utterly essential for everybody in the advanced industrial economies, suddenly you have Europeans, Japanese, South Koreans, Australians, Canadians saying, okay, we can't rely on the United States, but these guys are actually a fundamental national security problem right now. And we've got to find a way to work together, all of us, so that we have alternatives. In the same way that the Europeans had their eye off the ball on energy and allowed themselves to be dependent on Russia, really bad idea, for decades. In the same way that the Americans did that with semiconductors and TSMC right off of the Chinese coast, really bad idea, for decades. All of us have done this on critical minerals and rare earths. So, yeah, I think if you're China, you should have just, as they say, the Sun Tzu, right? When your enemy is making a mistake, let them, and don't intervene. And I think that the Chinese actually sort of have played a little too aggressively recently.
The new Prime Minister of Japan said she would intervene on behalf of Taiwan.
If they were attacked.
If they were attacked. The United States has had Biden administration seemed to have multiple positions on this, and I don't mean that as an indictment, but this notion of ambiguity, I think, was part of a little bit of the strategy.
Well, it didn't help that Nancy Pelosi also decided to go play by herself under the Biden administration.
And there was some friction certainly there. What's the over-under on China moving on Taiwan in the next decade?
Oh, decade is a long time, right? I mean, in the next, over the course of the Trump administration, I would say actually quite low.
Low.
And
why would you say under the course of the Trump? Is that just because of years or because of policy with Trump?
I think it's both. It's in part because the Chinese don't yet have the military capabilities in place, and you see every month there's a new corruption scandal that's hitting the top levels of the Chinese military. So how much would Xi want to rely on that to ensure, with a military that hasn't been used in sort of battle conditions, the way like the Russians have, for example, and learned some things maybe they didn't want to learn at the beginning of that war. But then you also have the fact that the Chinese see that Trump isn't looking for a trade war, like recognizes that he needs to bend the knee, that he needs to find a way not to cause problems for China. There's a mutually assured economic destruction between the two countries for now, at least, even if the long-term path is towards decoupling. And going to war against Taiwan, even if Trump's instinct, his impulse would be, that's pretty far away, not really my problem. But the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians wouldn't feel that way, and the Americans are very much on the ground there, intelligence sharing, troops, and all the rest. It'd be hard for the Americans to actually steer clear of that. And I don't see Xi Jinping as wanting to take that risk. Similar to the economy. The Chinese economy is not performing that well right now. He's not ready to launch the big bazooka of domestic stimulus. He's not suddenly going to take all of the provincial debt and take it on at the federal level, because he doesn't need to. Because Xi Jinping is thinking about 10 years down the line, as you suggested, 20 years down the line, and the fact that, he can wait. He is patient. He is more risk averse. He's being quite cautious about some of these bigger long-term strategic issues, specifically like Taiwan.
Is the policy of the United States decoupling or is it de-risking?
I think it is long-term, it's decoupling. And that's an aggressive thing to say. But, when I think about the commanding heights of the global economy over the next 5 years, we're talking about AI and advanced technologies. And these are places where what the Americans are doing and what the Chinese are doing are completely separate sets of investments. They're not interoperable. We're taking our researchers out of each other's programs. We're not collaborating. We're not communicating. We're doing completely different things. And so, we're going to other countries and we're saying it's not just about, if we want to talk about US-China, we have to talk about American diplomacy with third parties and say, well, we're pressuring the Mexicans to ensure there are no transshipments of Chinese goods through Mexico into the United States. We're pressuring the Netherlands to make sure that they're not actually, sort of selling software design or semiconductors into China. We're working on all of these countries to build alternate supply chains so that we don't rely on the Chinese. That's not de-risking. That's decoupling. That's where the Americans are going long term. But there's a recognition that for the next 1, 2, 3 years, you can't actually get that done. You can't execute on that strategy near term.
You mentioned Mexico. We can sort of connect the dot up to Canada. What is the Trump administration's bone to pick with Canada? What's the origin story? Was it personality with Trudeau? I mean, was it just, again, back to impulse? Or is there a strategy? I mean, this issue of sovereignty, Denmark, we've written about. I mean, we were down in Panama for a while.
Yeah.
We'll get to Venezuela perhaps in a moment with Maduro. But what is it? What is the bone to pick with Canada? Is there a strategy here? Is there a rationale?
Well, given that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was, again, after the Abraham Accords, arguably the second biggest win of the first Trump administration.
Trump's own negotiated
Trump's
agreement.
own negotiated agreement.
Yes.
And that's why I say the second Trump term is so different from the first. It's much more like I'm much more powerful, and I am in a position where I can force you to accept asymmetric negotiations that benefit me to a greater degree. And, yes, at the beginning, of course, it was Justin Trudeau and the fact that he really disliked it personally And so when he came down to Mar-a-Lago and Trump had him surrounded at that table and he started talking to Governor Trudeau and you'll remember that there were hockey matches and the rest where they were booing the American national anthem. And all of the countries, when I mention that the Americans are perceived as unreliable, but there are a whole bunch of countries that are still trying to find more effective ways of, can't we just get along?
Yeah.
Can't we not have a crisis? Canada, because they know the Americans so well, they are so angry.
Yeah.
You look at how few Canadians are traveling to the U.S.
We rely on
right now.
1.9 million a year just in the state of California. It's collapsed.
It's astonishing.
Absolutely collapsed. The economic damage, the self-harm we've done is off the charts. That's aside, but you're right. It's interesting. For the Canadians, it's raw.
It's raw.
Yeah.
Yeah. I talked to hotel owners in Boston, New England, that kind of stuff. Also, Canadian tourism is just falling off a fucking cliff.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
there's a huge amount of self-harm
Yeah.
in a country that really integrates, trusts the Americans, right? They're very similar people. And remember, Mark Carney won because of Trump.
Period.
He was not in there with the fighting chance otherwise. It was
And
going to
we'll
be
get to
pure
Lulu
vote.
and we'll get to all these others that are beneficiaries of Trump's policies.
Yeah. Australia, same thing happened.
It's interesting. It's a good point.
A number of elections that Trump actually pushed in the other direction.
Sheinbaum's, the president of Mexico, has played it from her perspective, Mexican perspective, well.
I would say so. I think she's been one of the
Sometimes a little
effective.
frustrating for other trading partners and relationships, i.e. Canada, California, and others. But she's got a lot more to lose. She's figuring out how to play Trump a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting, you're talking about a PhD, woman, environmental scientist, Berkeley grad. If she had been black and lesbian, you can't find me a demographic that's going to be more challenging for Trump to actually deal with, right? And yet she's talked with him frequently on the phone.
Yep.
She has engaged. She stands up for herself and her country on the issues that are utterly critical. Like, for example, you can't send the military indirectly. You can't send drones indirectly. We'll cooperate with you, but our sovereignty is utterly sacrosanct. But she's given on border security, which has made Trump look good. He's much more popular on that than he is on the economy right now.
Yep.
She has given on trying to get China out of their economy, which, frankly, the Chinese investments in Mexico haven't been that popular. They're not manufacturing cars, they're assembling them. Good jobs around that. They're sending in a whole bunch of cheap textiles. A lot of Mexican small and medium producers are losing their jobs. So, there's alignment on a lot of stuff. They had their absolutely biggest fentanyl bust in Mexico under Sheinbaum for Trump. They weren't doing that under Biden. And by the way, I just heard from her cabinet just last week that the bust in Nogales, I guess it was, with the United States actually grabbing all of these rifles, heavy rifles,
Well, they're going south.
that were going south, was the single biggest seizure that has happened from the
Get a
United
lot of
States to
attention.
Mexico.
Deserved a lot more attention.
But in Mexico, got a lot of attention.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been working on our own state national guard. I've deployed them to the border on precisely those operations, working in partnership with the National Guard in Mexico, which we have a formal relationship. So I applaud that effort. That was significant. And it's a good proof point of that relationship. When we look more now,
But of course, they are deeply worried about, what happens with trade between the U.S. and Mexico. It's the end of the day, as much as she's trying to manage it, and she's doing a good job, they are deeply uncomfortable with the Americans saying, hey, USMCA, don't care what that says. We're actually going to rip that off, and we're going to hit you hard unless you improve trade terms with us.
Yep.
That worries them a lot. Because, they are, a much smaller economy, and they are overwhelmingly reliant on the U.S.
exactly right.
Yeah.
The issues of narco trafficking, et cetera, it's obviously raised, and when I was down at COP in Brazil, this was a question. I had a press conference, a few hundred reporters, and it was interesting how many questions I had on this topic, not on climate issues.
They expect that the Americans are going to start bombing Venezuela any day.
mean, where did you? I mean, a lot of people are speculating. It's a little bit of wag the dog. There's a lot of distrust about the administration, particularly time Epstein files and everything else going on. Everything that arguably is going wrong. Trump's had a difficult few weeks, and I would argue a few months, but notably the last few weeks. What do you make of what's going on with these strikes? These votes? What do you make of? Is this a strategy to take out Maduro? Is it a strategy to create anxiety for their regime of sorts, for folks down in that region more broadly, beyond?
I mean, it clearly isn't just a strategy to take out these boats, because the expense and the amount of materiel that the Americans presently have arrayed off the coast is radically beyond what you would need for that, right?
They just put an aircraft carrier down there.
That's right. Yeah. Strike group. Yeah. No, so now I think what's interesting, though, is that unlike a lot of the policies you and I have been talking about in the past moments, this is one that Trump has not personally been driving details on.
This is Rubio?
It's Rubio, it's Ratcliffe and CIA, it's Stephen Miller, actually, as well. And they've really been pushing pretty hard to nothing is going to be worse than the Maduro regime right now. There are several reasons. It is cocaine export coming into the United States. It is oil going illegally to Cuba and then on to China. It is ideological that you've got Venezuela, you've got Nicaragua, you've got Cuba, these revolutionary leftist regimes, right, where otherwise in the region, most of these countries are turning towards the United States and towards the right. And so there's a whole bunch of things happening at the same time. And it's also a little bit of, hey, we were successful with Iran. You know, all we need to do is a little flex. We don't need boots on the ground. We can get rid of this guy. So I think that's what's driving them. But this is going to be a lot harder because, you know, you are at the end of the day talking about wanting Maduro out and what replaces him and how that gets done and who's responsible for that. I mean, chaos is a real option here, and chaos can easily be worse than the devil you know, as we've seen in Libya, as we've seen in Iraq. And I would hate to see that kind of quagmire on America's shoulders. Again, as much as I find Maduro utterly despicable and want to see this guy out of power.
It's interesting. So what's your over-under, just in terms of your assessment of risk, in terms of them escalating? It's clearly they've escalated significantly last week or so. Well, what do you anticipate in the next few months, months, in terms of any additional activities?
I would say close to 100% that there will be direct U.S. military strikes against targets in Venezuela. Yes. Now, that is not necessarily regime change. Yeah. I would be stunned if they don't. I'm stunned. Everything is oriented, including just the cadence of meetings in the Situation Room on this. The amount of intel and scenarios. There's no way to put effort into it. To just say, climb down, don't care. Unless Maduro were to be forced out absent that push. And I just think he has too much control for that to happen.
Interesting. Let's talk about control, things not happening. Clearly, the Trump administration overpromised significantly in terms of controlling the agenda for a peace deal with Putin in Ukraine. What do you make? I imagine we all came in with some different expectation that we can turn the page, that maybe the power personality, the relationships between the two leaders that could be persuaded. Where do you think we are right now? Was the bilat up in Alaska complete abject
czasu wrócił blask. Pojadę gdzieś, a za mną nic już nie będzie. Tyle miejsc, a jednak w domu najlepiej. Do siebie piszę list, by łatwiej, jeszcze łatwiej zgubić już za sobą łzy. Powiedz, ilu słów o sobie się nasłucham, ilu prostych kłamstw, nie wiem czemu wciąż potrafię im zaufać. O naiwna ja, za każdy świata koniec, za nowy start. Ilu słów musiałam się nasłuchać. O naiwna ja. Za krokiem krok, powoli bliżej do siebie. Minął rok, pogodna stała się jesień. Wracać do tych dni nie warto, już nie warto. Nie prowadzi losu nić. Powiedz, ilu słów o sobie się nasłucham, ilu prostych kłamstw, nie wiem czemu wciąż potrafię im zaufać. O naiwna ja, za każdy świata koniec, za nowy start. Ilu słów musiałam się nasłuchać. O naiwna ja. Ilu słów o sobie się nasłucham, ilu prostych kłamstw, nie wiem czemu wciąż potrafię im zaufać. O naiwna ja, za każdy świata koniec, za nowy start. Ilu słów musiałam się nasłuchać. O naiwna ja. Zostawili nam tylko kilka słów, tak jakby nigdy nie było nic, co mogłoby naprawić te dni. I znów na chwilę uciec od wszystkiego, jeśli się da. Przypomnieć sobie, jak to jest znów kochać ten świat. Na moment, chodź na moment, spójrz. Dziś przyszedł na nas czas, nie zgasną światła lamp. Ucieknijmy z marzeniami przez aleje gwiazd nieznanych. Krzyczmy ile sił, dziś wszystko albo nic. Chcemy tylko nocą tańczyć, aż po blady świt. En tidig morgon när solen stiger går en man för att börja en slitsam och det står en kvinna vid en fabriksport. Det är han och hon, du och jag. Genom tusentals fabriksportar går vi, proletärerna. Tidigt i gryningen och sent i solnedgången. I Brasilien, i Japan, i USA och i Sverige. Överallt där det finns fabriker, där finns också vi, arbetarna. Vi talar inte samma språk, men vi förstår varandra ändå, för vi tillhör samma klass. En del av oss lider under afrikanskt förtryck, en del under indiskt och en del under svenskt förtryck. Men förtryckta är vi alla av kapitalismen. En blågul flagga eller stjärnbaneret, det är inte våra symboler. Våra huvudstäder, det är Peking och Tirana. Där vajar den röda fanan. Kring den kan vi alla samlas och ingenting får splittra oss.
I alla länder, i alla städer. Där finns de, där finns vi, där finns du och jag. Vi är klassen som har plundrats, som slavar under borgarens lag. En lerig åker där regnet strilar, står en kvinna med hacka och ryggen böjd. Och hon tänker på dem i djungeln som i natt ska storma en höjd.
De folk som har mod och styrka att bekämpa sina förtryckare. Det är sådana som varje arbetare måste känna samhörighet med. För det är ju inga direktörer, kapitalister eller godsägare. Det är ju inga rikemän. Nej, det är sådana som du och jag. Det är arbetare och bönder. Sådana som varje dag måste slippa för sitt uppehälle. Men som har rätat på ryggarna och rest sig mot förtrycket. Deras väg måste vi också gå. Om inte evighet ska tryckas ner av penningens makt. Vietnams folk, Laos folk, Kambodjas folk. De är våra föredömen. De är våra hjältar.
En tidig morgon när solen stiger går en man för att börja en slitsam dag. Det står en kvinna vid en fabriksport. Det är han och hon, du och jag. I alla länder, i alla städer. Där finns de, där finns vi, där finns du och jag. Vi är klassen som har plundrats, som slavar under borgarens lag. I alla länder, i alla städer. Där finns de, där finns vi, där finns du och jag. Vi som bär världen på våra skuldror skall bli orkan och storm en dag. Kom med i kampen för socialismen. Då tar vi borgarnas rike. Då blir det snart, då blir det frihet. För den som arbetar, våra kära arbetarklassens lag. Kom med i kampen för socialismen. Så vi kan utrota utsugning, krig och nöd. Så vi kan njuta av det vi skapar när borgarorätten är död. Så vi kan njuta av det vi skapar.
December 1939. Finnish radio broadcasts crackle across Sweden with desperate pleas for help. The Soviet Union has invaded with over 500,000 men, thousands of tanks, and complete air superiority. Finland has 180,000 soldiers, obsolete equipment, and 3 weeks of ammunition. Every military expert in the world predicts Finland will fall within days. Sweden's government declares strict neutrality and forbids military intervention. But in a quiet Stockholm office, a 54-year-old general named Ernst Linder is about to commit an act that his own government will spend the next 50 years trying to erase from history. Welcome to the story of how Sweden's most successful 20th century combat commander led 8,000 volunteers into a war his government pretended didn't exist, won battles against impossible odds using tactics that would influence modern warfare, and was systematically written out of history because his victories were too embarrassing to acknowledge. This is the war Sweden fought but refuses to remember. This is the story of Ernst Linder and the ghost army that held the line when the world looked away. Before we understand why Ernst Linder became Sweden's most oppressed military hero, we must understand who he was before the Winter War transformed him from a respected officer into an officially non-existent ghost. Ernst Wilhelm Linder was born on May 15, 1885, in Stockholm, into a military family that traced its service back to the 30 Years' War. His grandfather had fought in the Norwegian-Swedish War of 1814. His father served as a captain in the coastal artillery. Military service was not just a career in the Linder family, it was identity, tradition, heritage. Young Ernst absorbed the stories of Swedish military glory from childhood, learning about Gustavus Adolphus's revolutionary combined arms tactics, Charles III's aggressive manoeuvre warfare, and the Swedish doctrine that small professional forces with superior training could defeat larger armies through tactical brilliance. Linder entered the Royal Swedish Army Cadet School at age 16 in 1901, part of a generation of officers who had come of age during Europe's most catastrophic century. His academic performance was exceptional. He excelled particularly in artillery science and tactical theory, graduating second in his class in 1905. His instructors noted his aggressive tactical instincts and uncommon ability to identify and exploit enemy weakness. These were not just compliments, they were prophecies of the commander he would become. Linder was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Swedish artillery in 1905, beginning a 35-year career that would see him rise through every rank while Sweden navigated the treacherous waters of European great power politics. The young Linder's early career coincided with Sweden's final abandonment of its great power ambitions. The dissolution of the Swedish-Norwegian Union in 1905 marks Sweden's recognition that it could no longer project military power beyond its borders. The Swedish military establishment divided into two camps. One faction accepted Sweden's reduced status and advocated for defensive neutrality, backed by minimal military capability. The other faction, to which Linder belonged, argued that genuine neutrality required the ability to punish any aggressor severely enough to make violation too costly. This philosophical divide would shape Swedish defence policy for a century, and would ultimately determine how Sweden treated its Winter War volunteers. Between 1906 and 1914, Lieutenant Linder served in various artillery postings across Sweden, from the fortresses guarding Stockholm to the northern garrisons near the Finnish border. He became an expert in cold weather artillery operations, learning the unique challenges of maintaining and firing artillery in Arctic conditions. Steel becomes brittle at -30 Celsius. Hydraulic recoil systems freeze. Propellant charges burn differently in extreme cold. Linder mastered these technical challenges through endless experimentation and meticulous documentation. His 1912 report on artillery operations in extreme cold became required reading at the Swedish Artillery School and would later prove invaluable when he commanded forces in the Finnish winter. When World War I erupted in 1914, Sweden declared neutrality, but neutrality required constant vigilance. Captain Linda, now commanding an artillery battery on the Swedish-Norwegian border, spent 4 years preparing defences against potential invasion from any direction. This was neutrality as armed deterrence, not passivity. Swedish forces mobilised to wartime strength, conducted constant training exercises, and maintained readiness to resist German or Russian or British violation of Swedish territory. Linda thrived in this environment. He developed rapid deployment techniques for moving artillery batteries by rail, established ammunition networks across southern Sweden, and trained his gunners to achieve first-round hits at maximum range. His battery was rated the most combat-ready unit in its division for 3 consecutive years. The interwar period saw Linda's steady advancement through the Swedish officer corps. Promoted to major in 1920, he attended the Swedish War College, where he studied the tactical innovations of World War I, paying particular attention to German infiltration tactics and British artillery fire control methods. His thesis analysed how small professional forces could use superior doctrine to defeat larger conscript armies, using historical examples from Frederick the Great, Napoleon, and the American Civil War. The thesis argued that modern weapons had increased the advantage of quality over quantity, that radio communications and motor transport enabled small units to concentrate combat power faster than large armies could react, and that future warfare would reward tactical innovation over numerical superiority. This was not just academic theory. This was the doctrine Linda would apply at Markievicz 20 years later. The date is November 30th, 1939. Soviet bombers appear over Helsinki at 9:25 a.m. without warning, without declaration of war. Within hours, 4 Soviet armies totaling 450,000 men crash across Finland's eastern border on a front stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Finland. Stalin's plan is simple and brutal. Overwhelm Finland in 2 weeks, install a puppet communist government, present the world with a fait accompli before anyone can intervene. The Red Army has 26 divisions, 2,500 tanks and 3,800 aircraft. Finland has 9 divisions, 32 tanks and 114 aircraft. The mathematics of annihilation are clear. Finland should not survive December, but in Sweden, something extraordinary is happening. Something that violates every rule of official neutrality. Something that will be hidden, denied, and suppressed for generations. Within 48 hours of the Soviet invasion, volunteer recruitment centres open in Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. They are not official. The Swedish government insists they do not exist. But by December 10th, over 12,000 Swedish men have volunteered to fight for Finland. These are not idealistic students or unemployed adventurers. These are professional soldiers, combat veterans from the Swedish military, officers with decades of experience, and they are organising themselves into a military force that officially does not exist. Ernst Linde stands at the centre of this shadow mobilisation. Born in 1885, Linde represents everything the modern Swedish establishment wants to forget about its own military heritage. He's a product of the old Swedish officer corps, trained in the traditions of Gustavus Adolphus and Charles XIII, steeped in the doctrines of aggressive manoeuvre warfare that built the Swedish Empire. He commanded artillery units in World War I neutrality patrol, rose through the ranks during Sweden's interwar military modernisation, and by 1939 holds the rank of Major General in the Swedish Army Reserve. He's exactly the kind of officer Sweden's pacifist politicians fear. Competent, aggressive, willing to act when politicians hesitate. On December 12, 1939, Linde receives unofficial orders that officially do not exist. The Swedish government maintains absolute public neutrality. But behind closed doors, the military establishment is terrified. If Finland falls, the Soviet Union will control the entire Baltic. Sweden will be isolated, surrounded, next on Stalin's list. The official policy is neutrality. The unofficial reality is survival. Linde is told to organise Swedish volunteers into an effective combat force. He's given no official authority, no government funding, no legal protection. If he succeeds, Sweden survives. If he fails, he will be court-martialed for violating neutrality. If he's captured by the Soviets, Sweden will deny he ever existed. Linder accepts immediately, but he understands the enormity of the task. Transforming civilians and reservists into an effective combat force normally requires months of training. He has weeks. The volunteers flooding into recruitment centres are not soldiers. Some are veterans from World War I neutrality service. But most are young men with only basic conscript training. They're eager, patriotic, brave. Bravery without training is just a faster route to death. Linder needs to create a real military force, and he needs to do it before Finland collapses completely. He begins by establishing a command structure borrowed directly from Swedish Army doctrine. The Svenska Frivilligkåren, the Swedish Volunteer Corps, is organised into 3 battalions of infantry, 1 artillery detachment, 1 signals company, 1 medical company, and 1 logistics battalion. Each infantry battalion consists of 4 companies of 180 men each. Each company has 3 rifle platoons and 1 heavy weapons platoon, with machine guns and light mortars. This is not arbitrary organisation. This is the standard Swedish Army battalion structure, designed for independent operations with organic fire support and communication capability. Linder is creating a combined arms force that can fight without relying on Finnish command and control. The officer selection process is ruthlessly meritocratic. Linder personally interviews over 200 candidates for company and platoon command positions. He rejects aristocratic officers with political connections but no combat experience. He rejects World War I veterans who are too old or physically unfit for Arctic warfare. He rejects anyone whose motivation seems more political than military. What he selects for is tactical competence, physical endurance, and the ability to make rapid decisions under stress. Many of his chosen officers are junior captains and lieutenants from the Swedish Army Reserve, men with peacetime training but aggressive tactical instincts. These are not famous names. These are professional soldiers willing to risk court-martial to fight for their principles. The training program Linder implements in those 2 weeks is impossibly compressed but tactically focused. He cannot teach basic infantry skills in 14 days, but he can teach Swedish Army doctrine, Arctic warfare techniques, and small unit tactics for winter combat. Every day begins with a 4-hour forced march on skis carrying full combat load. This is not conditioning, this is selection. Men who cannot keep pace are removed from the combat battalions and assigned to logistics and support roles. By the end of the first week, 40% of the original volunteers have been reassigned to non-combat positions. The remaining 60% have proven they can move 20 kilometres on skis in 3 hours, while carrying 30 kilograms of equipment. This is the basic requirement for survival in Finnish winter warfare. The tactical training focuses obsessively on the skills that will determine survival in combat. Night navigation through forest terrain, camouflage discipline in snow, maintenance of weapons in extreme cold, hand signals and non-verbal communication when radio fails, individual marksmanship at ranges beyond 300 metres, because Arctic air clarity makes long-range shooting possible and necessary, close-quarters battle in forests and buildings, because winter warfare often devolves into short-range engagements where surprise and speed determine victory. Every volunteer practices these skills for 8 hours daily for 2 weeks. It is not enough to create expert soldiers, but it is enough to create soldiers who will not die from basic mistakes. The equipment procurement is where the fiction of Swedish neutrality becomes farcical. Officially, the Swedish government is providing no military assistance to the volunteers. Unofficially, Swedish Army depots are emptying their warehouses. The volunteers receive Swedish Army Model 1896 rifles, Swedish Army uniforms, Swedish Army winter clothing, Swedish Army boots, Swedish Army ammunition, Swedish Army medical supplies, Swedish Army field kitchens.
Advance!
The paperwork shows these items were purchased by private subscription and donated by civilian organisations.
Position!
The reality is that the Swedish military establishment is equipping an expeditionary force while maintaining plausible deniability. The artillery detachment is particularly revealing. The volunteers received 12 75mm mountain guns, officially purchased from private sellers. These are Swedish Army artillery pieces removed from active inventory and transferred to volunteer control. They come with ammunition, fire control equipment, optical sights, and trained crews. The crews are Swedish Army artillerymen on leave from their regular units. The fire control officers are Swedish Army lieutenants who have resigned their commissions to volunteer. The entire charade is transparent to anyone paying attention. But Sweden's government maintains the fiction because the fiction serves diplomatic necessity. Within 2 weeks, Linda has transformed 8,160 volunteers from a chaotic mob into the Svenska Frivilligkåren, a combined arms force with its own artillery, medical corps, logistics train, and command structure. This is not a ragtag militia. This is a professional military formation organised according to Swedish Army doctrine, equipped with Swedish Army weapons, and led by Swedish Army officers. The only thing missing is official acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement will never come, because acknowledging this force means admitting Sweden has violated its own neutrality. So the fiction continues. The volunteers are private citizens, the weapons are privately purchased. The officers are civilians with military experience, and Ernst Linder, a major general in the Swedish Army Reserve, is a volunteer coordinator with no command authority. By January 15, 1940, Linder's forces ready. They board trains for the Finnish border disguised as aid workers and medical volunteers. The Swedish press is forbidden from reporting their departure. The Swedish government issues statements condemning individual citizens who violate neutrality. Those individual citizens carry Swedish Army rifles, wear Swedish Army uniforms, and march under Swedish Army discipline. They are a ghost division, officially non-existent, operationally lethal. Linda arrives in Finland on January 21st, 1940. The situation is catastrophic. The Soviet offensive has been bloodied but not stopped. Finnish forces under Marshal Mannerheim have achieved stunning tactical victories at Suomussalmi and along the Mannerheim line, but losses are unsustainable. Finland is running out of men, out of ammunition, out of time. The Swedish Volunteer Corps represents the largest foreign military force fighting for Finland. More than the Danes, more than the Norwegians, more than all other foreign volunteers combined. Linda understands immediately what is expected of him. These volunteers are not symbolic support. They are Finland's strategic reserve. They will be sent to the most critical sectors. They will face the heaviest Soviet attacks. They will hold, or Finland will fall. Finnish High Command assigns Linda's force to the northern front, specifically the Salla and Merkijärvi sectors. This is not an accident. This is where Finland is most vulnerable. The Salla sector guards the critical rail line to Kemijärvi. If the Soviets break through here, they can cut Finland in half, severing the northern territories from the south. The Merkijärvi sector protects the approaches to Rovaniemi and the vital nickel mines at Petsamo. Lose these positions and Finland's war economy collapses. These are not secondary fronts. These are existential choke points, and they are held by exhausted Finnish units that have been fighting for 7 weeks without relief. Linda arrives at the Merkijärvi front on February 1st, 1940. The temperature is minus 35 Celsius. The Soviet 122nd Rifle Division, reinforced with armour and artillery, is preparing a major offensive. Finnish intelligence estimates Soviet forces at 18,000 men, supported by 70 tanks and 120 artillery pieces. Linda's Swedish Volunteer Corps numbers 32,100 men in this sector, with no tanks, 16 artillery pieces, and limited anti-tank weapons. The mathematics are brutal. But Linder is not a mathematician. He is a tactician, and he understands something the Soviet commanders do not. Winter warfare is not about numbers. It is about mobility, surprise, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness. The Merkayavi sector is a nightmare of tactical complexity. The terrain consists of frozen lakes, dense pine forest, granite ridges, and open snowfields. Visibility varies from 0 during blizzards to crystal clarity on cold, clear days when you can see for kilometres. Temperatures fluctuate between -20 and -45 Celsius. Daylight lasts only 4 hours in early February this far north. The Soviet forces are deployed along the main road from the Soviet border toward Chemyevi, occupying defensive positions designed for summer warfare. Their trenches are shallow because the frozen ground is nearly impossible to dig. Their bunkers are above ground, clearly visible against the snow. Their supply lines run along predictable routes because off-road movement in deep snow is impossible for their heavy vehicles. Linder spends the first week reconnoitering the terrain personally, not from maps, not from aerial photographs. He skis the front line with his battalion commanders, studying Soviet positions with his own eyes, identifying weaknesses, mapping approach routes that exist only in winter when lakes and swamps freeze solid. This personal reconnaissance is dangerous. Soviet patrols and snipers are active. But Linder is a product of the old Swedish officer tradition that requires commanders to know the ground intimately, to see what their soldiers will face, to never ask men to execute maneuvers the commander himself has not scouted personally. What he discovers changes everything. The Soviet 122nd Division is deployed according to standard Red Army doctrine developed for the vast plains of Ukraine and Western Russia. Massed forces along obvious approach routes. Heavy reliance on artillery preparation followed by tank-led assaults. Defensive positions designed for summer warfare where extensive trench networks are possible. But this is not Ukraine. This is the Arctic. The Soviets are fighting according to a doctrine designed for a completely different environment, and they are suffering for it. Their trenches are shallow and poorly camouflaged against snow. Their bunkers provide limited protection against cold and are highly visible. Their heavy vehicles are road-bound, unable to maneuver through deep snow. Their supply convoys are predictable targets travelling on single-lane roads that cannot be bypassed. More importantly, Linder identifies a critical weakness in Soviet tactical psychology. The Red Army in 1940 is still recovering from Stalin's purges of 1937-1938, which executed over 30,000 officers, including 3 of 5 field marshals and 13 of 15 army commanders. The survivors are terrified of initiative, terrified of deviation from doctrine, terrified of making decisions that might be interpreted as political disloyalty. Soviet commanders at the division and regiment level execute orders with bureaucratic precision, but show no tactical flexibility. They attack where ordered, retreat where permitted, and never exploit opportunities that were not in the original plan. This makes them predictable. And predictability is the greatest weakness an army can have. Linder's plan for defending Merkayavi exploits every one of these Soviet weaknesses while maximizing Swedish advantages. The Swedish doctrine he implements comes from centuries of Swedish military tradition, adapted for modern Arctic warfare. It combines the aggressive maneuver warfare of the Karelian Gopo doctrine with Finnish innovations in winter combat pioneered by the Finns earlier in the war. The core principle is simple but demanding. Never fight Soviet strength head-on. Never allow the enemy to mass their superior firepower against fixed Swedish positions. Instead, fragment Soviet units into isolated